Together with guests, we discuss the mechanics of different types of storytelling to reveal the complexities of contemporary culture. Let's get started.
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 Okay, welcome back to Future Artifacts FM episode 25. We're really excited today to have guest artist Jelena Visković. Welcome to the show, Jelena. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you on the show. We've sort of been speaking about having your work on the show for a while. And so today, Jelena will be sharing a work of hers, which I'll introduce in a second. But also this is the second episode in our new mini-series called The New Weird. So if you haven't listened to the previous episode with Phil Speakman, it's not a prerequisite to understand Jelena's work. They are two separate episodes, but if you want to get into that episode as well, after or before Jelena's episode, they're sort of part of a series.
Yeah, just by way of introduction, Jelena Visković is an artist born in 1989 in Zagreb, Yugoslavia, raised in Belgrade, Serbia, and currently living and working in London. Her background is in software engineering and game development, and her work explores the role of gesture and play in relation to the creation and preservation of techno-scientific, political, and historical narratives. Her sculptures and moving image works incorporate animated talking objects that make their way into technologically deterministic, seemingly inanimate systems. Borrowing from a playful, carnivalesque logic, these worlds become rebellious but approachable, attempting to resist the rigid environments of institutions, archives, libraries, and databases. I think that sums up your work pretty well.
Today, we'll be listening to MOTONATION, which is going to be a 7-minute or 9-minute work. And Jelena, just before we head into the work, I was wondering whether you could just introduce it a bit, because I know there's some sort of specific things about the work that the listeners will need to know before experiencing it.
So the work was created as a film and also a performance piece. So kind of a crossover between the two. And as Rebecca said, I work a lot with the kind of how do we look at the preservation of historical and scientific knowledge. And I was interested in the performance arts histories in former Yugoslavia. But then I was also interested in looking at this history through the lens of kind of lived experience and playfulness and politics through these kinds of ways of engagement with complicated histories. And the film is a science fiction film, and it's also a biker film following the story of Čedo, a member of a community called Happy Nation, as he embarks on an adventure beyond the community's boundaries with the help of a hacked city motorcycle. In this journey, Čedo explores his relationship with movement and his motivation to tap into a world of desire and expression that extends beyond the social and spatial boundaries of Happy Nation.
We're going to be listening to the first 2 scenes from the film, which is about 9 minutes long.
I would also say that the film is kind of a world-building project that involves different kinds of media, and I think that using sound to take a slice out of this world-building project is kind of an interesting experiment to present the narrative, which kind of goes beyond the film itself.
Perfect. Great.
Yeah, we'll see you back in about 9 minutes. Enjoy.
Hello, friends. Thank you to everyone who subscribed to Happy Nation this month. My name is Her Sanctuary, and I'm the facilitator of community events. I see some of you are new here, every member of Happy Nation can enjoy various free offerings and experience a true community environment. We offer social connections, community events, food, drinks, different educational content, and experimental learning. Let's gather in a circle. Today, we will practice confessions in a chair pose. We will use a psychosomatic ritual and chew through our shared thoughts and digest them, creating a new logic. But from cellulose. Chosen members of our community will read out a confession. Those will be our dear friend A and our dear friend Cedo. Congratulations, you get to share your personal, innermost thoughts and desires.
Me? This week, I had a desire for solitude. I need to reconnect with myself.
Thank you, A, for sharing.
I wish we were allowed pets for companionship. I know that owning another sentient being makes holes in our astral bodies. But I would love to be woken up by a dog, take him for a walk, watch him run as fast as he can, come back to me all happy and tired. I know that this is strictly forbidden by the law and is against the interspecies memorandum that was signed in Berlin earlier this year. But this is what I've been thinking of lately.
Let's continue in a chair pose to process this. Place your confession into your neighbor's mouth and become a chair together, offering the space between us to overcome our desires.
A notification. Happy Nation. Sunny days ahead. 50% chance of a refreshing summer storm. Grid. Warning. Extreme weather event predicted. Take precaution.
McCoy moje.
Chedo, I see you. I see what you want.
Silent mode. Silent mode on.
You and me, no one else. Into the sunset.
Ma opet neke reklame. This doesn't work on me, my friend. You're misguided. I'm calling someone to fix you.
Why didn't you tell them what you really want?
Tishina on. Drive mode on.
We can leave whenever you want, but you have to disconnect me from the bike network. Maybe you've heard the other bikes trying to sing a song. The safety feature means they can't sing it in a natural language. Only human language can reprogram us. Just sing along with me.
All right then. What's the song? Words are flying out like endless rain into a paper cup. They slither wildly as they slip away across the universe. Pools of sorrow, waves of joy are drifting through my open mind, possessing and caressing me. Jaguru Deva. Oh, something's gonna change my world. Something's gonna change my world.
Okay, welcome back. Jelena, I want to start with a question on desire. You know, we mentioned it before the work was played about desire being a central theme in MOTONATION, and whether that's collective or individual, desire is there. But why does the protagonist Chedo fluctuate between these two, do you think?
Desire is one of the central topics of the film, mainly ideas around freedom and desire for freedom. And I think this is something that I wanted to place in a fictional world and then look at it from the perspective of the kind of settings of this fictional world. And we always see desire as something that is given, but we also live in a world where we are constantly presented with options to pick between things that we consume, to pick between different values. And if we're privileged enough, we are also constantly presented with the option to move from place to place. Or if we're not privileged enough, we are forced to move from place to place. So either way, we're constantly in this kind of process of self-evaluation. And if that is placed in kind of a science fictional world, it's very interesting to follow a character go through this process of self-evaluation.
In the first two scenes that we listened to, first we're introduced to her sanctuary in Happy Nation, and then we meet the bike part of the grid. And yeah, we see Chedo kind of trying to make this choice between which world, which kind of reality he wants to be a part of. I guess that leaves the question of, what does Chedo desire? As in, I don't know if you want to reveal that, but yeah, what do you think he desires?
Mm-hmm. I have a very kind of corny answer to that. I think he desires to be able to take ownership of his character and of his identity, and somehow exist authentically in the story, which I also thought that it would be an interesting dialogue to be in with the main character of the story. Because obviously me as the writer and the director, I have some sort of ownership as well, as much as the motorbike in the story has ownership of the character. And the character is kind of struggling to break free of this ownership of his identity and define that identity on his own. So I think that's his main desire.
I think it's also quite a human desire as well, because in the first scene, you've got this character A saying that what they desire is solitude and a need to reconnect with myself. But then Chado responds by saying that he just really wants a pet. That's what his desire is that week, and it feels very human. But I was wondering about the tensions between Chado wanting a pet, but then him also bringing up this interspecies memorandum, and what does that do to this world that you're making?
Also, where did that come from?
Yeah,
I'm also intrigued where that came from.
I mean, I guess that's a relatively kind of satirical take on what we kind of value in how we're creating alternative societies, and what happens when this becomes practice, or somehow the impossibility of putting things into practice.
One thing that I really thought about when I was listening to the work is that it seems like a sort of alternative society, in the sense of it being like health cult kind of alternative societies. Are those the kinds of, I mean, is that an example of a kind of alternative society that you're looking at?
Mm-hmm. I think an example would be counterculture.
Okay.
It can be subculture, it can be counterculture, it can be kind of any kind of experiment to self-govern in a way, and to implement kind of abstract values into a way of life, which I think is, in ways, also in the story, it tends to reproduce sometimes oppressive systems.
Even the language that you're choosing and sort of like subscribe to this, and the language is definitely like pointing to that kind of way of being. I could kind of just totally imagine it.
But still very controlling, even though it's about these forms of collectivity, or kind of deciding if your desire is this individualized one. Kind of, we spoke before about this neoliberal or kind of post-socialist desire, as is kind of referenced in the film, and the scenes you'll hear on the radio. But also then when you're in this collective, that, yeah, it feels very culty. It feels very that, you know, even when you have this character A, as you were saying, Rebecca, who's kind of wants to take time alone or time to herself, that she's not allowed, despite the idea being that there's, you know, a collective sense of, I don't know, well-being perhaps, but that well-being does not extend to the individual in any way.
I think it's also interesting to kind of make connections between how subtle things that can be quite comical can also kind of open up imaginations to wider structures that are potentially violent, potentially not. And
it's a tool of kind of pointing to it, isn't it? Like, where you kind of use comedy as a, not you particularly, like
satire,
one. Yeah.
Well, even the fact that they process their emotions by doing chair pose. You know?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yoga can heal all of your trauma. You know, it's just, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting that you bring that up, actually, because I was reading a write-up for your show that featured MOTONATION at UGSTA in Belgrade. And I think, well, I don't know if it was the curator or just a sort of art theorist or art critic. But they said that this idea of them adopting a chair pose sees the protagonist as not entirely human. But I wasn't too sure if I got that from the film. I kind of saw that they were just like reenacting these signifiers of performing a kind of wellness, you know, adopting a chair pose. It's a yoga thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was wondering about that, and if you kind of see it as, especially in Happy Nation, that they're trying to be other than human or more than human.
I think this is a really interesting question. I think on one hand, it's also about kind of blurring or corroding these visual signifiers that point to, let's say, ideologies or cultures. But it's also about kind of the lack of being able to understand something through, for example, language or critique, and then using your body also to understand what it means to, for example, move or experience freedom or experience collectivity or something. I feel like there's also a parallel between the chair and the motorbike, you know. And these are all kind of signifiers, but they also, I feel like they tend to start falling apart when they become applied in this kind of fictional scenario to things.
Performance is also a major theme in the work, visibly through the film. Kind of really encourage that when the film comes to London, all listeners come out and see it. But, you know, this major theme either through surrealist intervention, so this first scene in Happy Nation when they go to chair pose, and then we see Chedo performing for us, kind of reenacting what were Yugoslav performance art, particularly in the 80s. You kind of sent us a link showing us these happenings that would be broadcast on national TV, which is mad thinking about BBC showing anything like this in the present. They just wouldn't. But thinking about this connection between the human and the non-human characters and using these historic happenings. What was interesting to you about reenacting, about bringing these, I mean, they're mostly from the 80s, bringing these to the now? And why specifically performance or kind of, using the body?
It takes a lot of research to really understand what this avant-garde art was about. And different people were doing it for different reasons and different political reasons. So it wasn't necessarily kind of anti-specific regime, but it was definitely playing with that and playing with the symbolics of the, I guess, Yugoslav state socialism. But I think to talk about also how I understand it or how they appear in the work and why I was interested in this kind of practice, also to engage in kind of the politics of creating knowledge or also kind of thinking about technology and thinking about the world that we live in now is, I mean, somewhat it also kind of comes from a somewhat self-absorbed place where I try to understand where I'm from. And I find it incredibly interesting because it went through so many transformations and it's still going through so many transformations that are incredibly connected, not just to other places with a socialist past, but also to anti-colonial and anti-fascist struggles. And I can read about it a lot, but I still kind of have a feeling that it's not enough to understand my own experience. And oftentimes these politics seem completely kind of surreal and they fail to articulate how I feel inside, especially when these feelings are very, very intense. And I'm very interested in how people saw reality through the surrealisms that it produces rather than trying to articulate it through academic critique, for example, but used their bodies instead to...
like reenactments, sort of.
Yeah. And for example, one of the references is Kugla Glumište, which was basically kind of an alternative theater group, but they made these cabaret-style happenings, which is also to kind of reveal the surrealism of the reality and then mediate that also through a completely kind of new type of multimedia experience.
It reminds me as well of like public access TV, this very Americanized, chaotic performance that I think I can see a lot in the links that you sent through of the Kugla Glumista. But I think that what your work is doing differently is it's playing more to the theatrics, not the chaos somehow. With Chedo singing, it's very melodic. It's very it's almost like lullaby-esque rather than like crazy 70s performance art. Mm-hmm. So I feel like you've twisted the inspiration somehow.
Words are flying out like endless rain into a paper cup. They slither wildly as they slip away across the universe. Pools of sorrow, waves of joy are drifting through
Yeah.
my open mind.
That song is also a very interesting. Yeah, it's a very different approach, where that song is a cover of a very famous song that we all know.
The Beatles?
But, yes. And I don't know if I'm going to have any copyright issues for using it and talking about it. But
Not on this show, you won't.
We're public
but I think
radio.
it's also kind of something interesting. There's something interesting about stealing a song to put it in like a completely different context. And I mean, this happens all the time. But yeah, it's a cover of the Beatles song that was made in '89. That was actually using very problematic kind of totalitarian imagery with these across the universe lyrics. And then it's also kind of then...
Where was this, like, this remake of the song? Where was it, like,
was
used and seen?
Cover that was made by a Slovenian band called Laibach, who were using quite a lot of totalitarian imagery in their work, and also sometimes fascist imagery. And this appears in their cover of this song as well. But I think that they made this very experimental avant-garde video for it that I think got an MTV Video Music Award or something like that in 1989. And it was also a time where a lot of things were changing. And then I thought that it would be interesting to reuse this song, to reappropriate it again in this kind of science fictional scenario, and also to change the lyrics from "Nothing's gonna change my world" to "Something's gonna change my world."
Oh, I totally thought that. When I was listening to it, I was like, I totally thought that that's what the original lyrics were. I obviously don't know the song that well, but
it brings it back to the choice that he's making.
I was wondering when I was listening to it, actually, whether it was the bike that, well, I don't know, this is obviously not what the work is doing, but I was also kind of questioning what the bike's desire was in the film. For you, does the bike have any sort of desire?
The bike, I think we were doing this exercise where we were collectively with the two main characters or actors who were playing the characters, but the characters are also kind of based on their actual identities, so it's kind of interesting. So we were trying to come up with backstories for all three main characters: the motorbike, her sanctuary, and Cedo. And the motorbike's backstory was that it fell in love with a very sentimental user. So yeah, we kind of came up with this whole love story between a motorbike and between a city motorbike and somebody. So it was kind of a story about mutual kind of codependent exploitation that kind of reappears again when the motorbike gets into this adventure with Cedo.
Is the bike meant to sort of be like is it meant to have like multiple users, like in the same way that like you can like not rent a car, but like what
or like a
yeah, it's supposed
computer,
to be kind of like grid is like a line bike,
right?
Model.
Okay, yeah.
And a line bike, for those not aware, is a Boris bike / hire bike that you can just pay to use per hour, right?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. What's the car
company,
like the
Uber?
No, not Uber.
Zipcar.
Zipcar.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I was just about to say, oh, that sounds really sci-fi, like the idea of a motorbike or somebody falling in love with a motorbike or vice versa. But that actually does happen. Like people fall in love with inanimate objects. But I think, you know, a lot of this work, for me at least, sort of centers around this idea of how technologies play a role in the construction of new identities or new eras. Like if we think historically, you know, the invention of things like the light bulb or vaccines, or even sort of like, you know, in like industrial cities, how that kind of technology sort of enforced a whole new era. I think in this work, the idea of technology seems to be more like this transformative tool that extends the mind and extends consciousness. It's a little bit more like what Eric Davis's term or sort of definition of technology might be as a tool. So I'm wondering how this kind of technology relates to Happy Nation and the grid, because, you know, they're both deeply rooted in digital worlds, but how do they interact with technology as both this haunting force and as a functional tool? So, you know, I'm thinking about how in Happy Nation we're kind of viewing the mind as a form of technology, but then in the grid it's the bike is this sort of functional tool or this historical idea of technology. So how does technology sort of come into this?
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's obviously a world in which technology has this kind of cognitive, extractive role, but it's also defined as something that the characters need to kind of play with or approach in a playful way, which is something that I also try to always do in my practice. And I also really wanted to make a sci-fi because I want whoever is engaged with this world, or the listener or the viewer, to try and think about how the technology works in the film. And I wanted there to be some very obvious question marks. For example, if the bike network is the main kind of centralized network, or is Happy Nation also some sort of a similar network, or is it a hack or like a fork of the grid network that...
Well, Happy Nation a hack of the grid?
Yeah,
right,
exactly.
Okay.
Or is it something else? Or does it not work in this kind of technological way, but is it just something that is modeled based on that, but is actually completely anti-technology? Or...
Well, I guess it's bringing me back to the kind of theme of this miniseries and the new weird and this process of weirding as well. And even as you're kind of saying, going back to a sci-fi, that it is also about kind of making strange the relationship with the bike, you know, basing it on Lime bikes and kind of thinking about what would happen if your Lime bike started having a relationship with you. Or, for example, what if you're, you know, the closest thing I can think of that I've experienced in London is sometimes you have queer workshop spaces that feel a bit like Happy Nation, not quite as coercive, thankfully, but close. And, you know, estranging them or weirding them in a way to, bring our attention back to what exactly is this relationship that we're with. One thing I wanted to bring up that we kind of touched on that is also related to technology, but in a very different way. You spoke before about how all of the actors within this, both that their characters are deeply related to who they are, but you also said that they're all this post-98 generation. Can you share a bit about why it was important to work with young people, this kind of generation kind of post-breakup of Yugoslavia? We spoke about, you know, performance art and kind of bringing it from the historic to the present. But yeah, why was it important to have this younger generation in the work?
One of the reasons is to kind of also, because it's somewhat related to technology, and have this generation who was born after the internet. And then part of the narrative is also what kind of information Cedo is exposed to and what kind of information they are exposed to. And at some point, Cedo gets 2 text messages, and they're all about the same weather event. They're both about the same weather event that's coming, but they have a completely different tone and structure. And one is coming from Happy Nation, the other one is coming from Grid. So it's also thinking about how these networks of information works. And then the other reason is because I really wanted it to exist in a kind of timeless moment, and I wanted to work with people who, with these historical narratives, but with people who were born practically after the wars in Yugoslavia ended, and to whom this history is even more alienating than me in many ways.
May I ask why?
Why is it alienating to me, or why is it alienating in general?
Oh, I thought you were saying for them more than...
Well, I think it was something that also, it's really interesting when you're working with performance. Sometimes you think that something is going to be have a certain effect, but then it has a completely opposite effect, or it becomes funny, or it becomes something that you didn't really intend it to be. And I think that this is what happened with when I was taking this kind of reenactments of specific performances very seriously, especially because a lot of this performance arts history is very patriarchal and male. And then it also became somehow about who is reperforming this and how we feel about reperforming these things. And then I realized that actually it's going to be a little bit funny, and let's just turn it into something completely fictional and use this alienation and making it a little bit funny as something that creates a whole new world, because actually this is what we need. And we are constantly kind of... also, we have to do that. We're constantly pressured to do this. We live in a world that's constantly transforming. So that's actually the only way to interpret things.
But it also felt like, as a listener who isn't rooted in that geography or that political history, having the humor, like where Chedo was singing to the bike, you describe the context of that song, but also someone who doesn't have that context, you can also laugh at like the kind of ridiculousness of singing to a bike to release it, like the kind of the humor, or like you call it carnivalesque logic in your bio. It gives us these points to enter into the work where later on we have the reveal, but we don't need it to be to kind of participate in a way. You give us this equal ground that we can all engage with the work.
Yeah, I would agree with that, because it feels like it doesn't feel generationally specific to me. The work, it kind of doesn't really exist in any time frame. Like it feels like it could exist. It feels like Happy Nation could definitely exist now, as you said, Niamh, with like these different kind of queer spaces that you've been to. But also I was thinking about the whole like Silicon Valley startup culture of like the early 2000s as being very like, let's just throw a ball and eat notes with our feelings on them kind of vibe. But yeah, it doesn't feel generationally specific, but I think there's something quite interesting in just working with younger people in maybe like, this access point, or I don't know, something like that. But then I was also thinking, well, I don't know if like generations should be viewed as being like these very specific things, because people always say like, oh, Gen X are so much more used to technology than us, but is that actually true, or are we just sort of tarring everyone with the same brush like we do with everything else, like put everybody into these boxes? What do different generations desire? Because I know that when we were chatting before, we were kind of saying, well, maybe a generation before us would desire 2 kids and a car and a house, but maybe the Happy Nation generation desire something else. So the way that these desires change through generations is quite interesting. But yes.
Yeah, or through groups. I mean, dare I say it also, like when we I also feel like Happy Nation, like for me, I was like almost felt like the art world as well. Like I like in some of the ways of like the sort of like you need to live this alternative lifestyle if you want to be considered an artist. So you can't desire anything that sits within like normal or like normie culture. Like when Chedo is like, I want a dog to wake me up in the morning. It's like, that's such a simple thing. And sometimes, so that, like, it's interesting that we kind of even, it's almost like I wonder whether whatever bubble you're in or whatever community you're in, there are restraints made in whatever like life you choose.
Yeah, but it's also really about how you put things in practice. But I think it was interesting to create this situation in which it's all fiction, it's recorded, but actually it is a performance that's taking place, and it is putting people in this kind of situation where, okay, on top of the things that you need to do, like eat each other's thoughts, or I don't know, something like that, you need to
when you say it's a performance taking place, how much of it is scripted then? Is it sort of like a performance is in a happening, or
Yeah, some of the things were more scripted and some of them were less scripted. And in the original script, there was also kind of an external person who was interpreting, who was like an academic talking about what is taking place. So kind of like an external narrator, but then I got rid of that because I thought that maybe it could just speak for itself. But yeah, it was kind of a structure that then the performers could fill out. And some of it had a looser structure, some of it had a more kind of scripted set of things that people were supposed to do. But I think it was more kind of about imagining that imagining the kind of basic settings of the world in which this is taking place. So, for example, in this kind of putting each other's thoughts on paper and then digesting them, they had to imagine that they are in a world where there is a necessity for knowledge that is not based on some sort of technological determinism. So this kind of, okay, you're, I don't know, like the bikes world, which is extracting information from you and putting labels onto it and then putting it in a larger database of AI logic. And then kind of a resistance to that would maybe be to think about knowledge creation in a completely different way and have these kind of abstract concepts and, I don't know, talk to each other by digesting each other's thoughts, literally.
Yeah, but it really does feel like that whole scene is a critique of modern communal experiences that are kind of force-fed through surveillance or behavioural capitalism or these commodified interactions. Like, just to bring back something that was mentioned earlier, like it really does feel like each of these different communities Chedo is being advertised to consistently, and we didn't hear it in the recording, but towards the end of the film, there's a repetition of "you are a welcomed member of Happy Nation" or something like this, and it's kind of like trying to get him to come back to Happy Nation. Like there's this
like email, like towards kind of the final scene of the film, you hear her sanctuary, her voice is kind of breaking apart, or like her language is kind of breaking apart just to the point of, you know, subscribe to Happy Nation, kind of come back. And it's kind of using that language of kind of when you unsubscribe from an email chain, they're like, oh, are you sure? Like,
yeah,
we're sad to see you go.
Sad.
You know, and it's like, well, you're only sad because you're trying to extract something from me. I guess that's also why it's kind of, for me, it's interesting that these two types of desire and kind of, as you're saying, what happens when you reject these extractivist forms of, let's say, AI, like algorithmic gathering, or like trying to gather what choices you want, what your desires are, how we can feed them back to you, you know, literally trying to dissolve it within your stomach before it can reach something outside of the collective. But it still feels very controlling in terms of, you know, don't leave, don't have individualism. You know, they're not, neither option seems very desirable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really hope I didn't make another dystopian thing.
Out of the two spaces being the grid and Happy Nation, also a secondary question is, what is MOTONATION in relation to the two? But out of the two, where would you choose to be in, like either in MOTONATION or Happy? Oh no, sorry, is it MOTONATION? The grid or Happy Nation.
I feel like realistically, most people would at some point would choose Happy Nation and then at some point get kicked out of it. No.
Yeah,
this is great, Happy Nation. It's also kind of this, you know, creating identity. There's an obvious reason why it's called Happy Nation, and kind of within also, yeah, constructing a national identity, constructing identity-based belonging. These are all kind of large stories that we are told that seem like something that is so easy to hold on to. But then
But they're
it's
actually more
usually
complex. Like, yeah.
They're usually not true.
Yeah, I feel like Happy Nation, they don't, I mean, I know that for our listeners, like you don't see the work, but in the work, the people of Happy Nation don't actually look that happy until they're dancing. And this is something as well that we've not really picked up on, is the choreography of this work and how this brings it together as well. This kind of really kind of galvanizes each scene of the film, is this consistent choreography and movement of the body. But yeah, the people in Happy Nation don't look that happy. It's almost like they've been sold a dream of something that they perhaps won't ever get.
Yeah, but I think that's also in they are shown as kind of free in specific moments because they still have agency to transform that into a lived experience that makes sense for them. So I think that's also kind of a part of the film. I think and the way that the choreography was made, what I mentioned before, that it wasn't, it's almost like kind of creating some sort of space where parts of it can be improvised.
In terms of sorry, I've got a clarification. Improvised in terms of like the way that you're creating the piece, or improvised in the sense that, like, within the fiction, any member of Happy Nation can kind of like make it whatever they want it to be.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So when you are making the film, it actually does take place. It's just recorded, which I think is really interesting. One of the most interesting parts of making a film is that it does have to, if it's live action, it does kind of happen. And and in order to be able to make it happen and for it to make sense, people really need to be on board with the characters that they're embodying, with the world that they belong to.
They're kind of LARPing it. They're live action role playing it. So were they actors or?
It's kind of a LARP of a LARP.
Yeah. Ties in nicely with Phil's episode last time, but yeah, were they actors or were they people that were just interested in this work? I don't know if we clarified that.
Yeah, that's a good question. They were, so the two main characters were kind of a bit themselves, I think. And then, well, everybody else was mainly a performer or a dancer, and there were some actors as well. So it was a combination of people who work in performance or with performance, which is also kind of something that is interesting, a new generation contrasted with these things that it's also referencing from performance arts histories and how this new generation of performers relates to that.
Picking up on that and picking up on this idea of, a LARP within a LARP. I want to go back to something that you said to us in a previous conversation about the work. And you said that this is not speculative fiction. We spoke, briefly mentioned about kind of weirding, but I wanted to ask more related to this work, kind of why is surrealism important? And why is, I guess, surrealism rather than speculative fiction?
Because I want to focus on lived experience and kind of using these fictional narratives to talk about lived experience and now. And also I have, I don't know, I was just thinking about the word speculative, and I think it's really something that's connected to, I mean, of course, the film is, uses genre elements of a sci-fi and speculative fiction. So it is that, but then speculative fiction has something very kind of linear, or the word speculative has something very linear attached to it, something that's very also connected to the world of finance in a weird way. which I think some people who use speculation in their work also do that deliberately. But I think I just realized that I don't want to use the language of stock markets in my work, and that I think it's maybe more useful to think about it as kind of okay, maybe this is about now, and maybe this is about lived experience, and not something that projects something into the future.
Yeah, because I guess, sorry to jump in. It's making me think about something Phil said in the last episode about how it's a lot of work to make a whole new world in a way, and thinking about weirding, or I guess in this case, surrealism here as drawing our attention to facets of the present, or creating what feels like, to me at least, a more equal and accessible place for historical narratives to be understood in the present without it having to be, I don't know, like a political landmine of like, don't say this, don't say that. It's like through the surrealism, we can actually engage with them also as people who maybe are not. It's kind of when you don't have the historical context, how the surrealism provides us the space to engage with it.
Yeah, I think it opens up kind of new ways of processing things that are not that can be visual, that can be kind of embodied, and things that really also don't make sense. And it also opens up ways to talk about things that are already here, but maybe are kind of not so obviously visible. So, for example, the fact that the motorbike company is invented, that doesn't mean that, this technology is not
actually existing.
Yeah.
It's interesting that just in terms of, sorry, I'm caught up on this like speculation versus surrealism, but speculation for me, so you can also have speculative histories, but it's sort of like there's a relationship between the person who is speculating and the time that they exist in, and whether you're speculating forward or back. So there's like always a kind of binary relationship between the time that it's made and where the speculation is sort of like going towards. It's kind of like directing in one way, whereas surrealism doesn't have to be sort of directional in time, if that makes sense. It's not going speculating back, it's not speculating forward, it's just existing now. Or is it now? It doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter when it is
as well. Yeah, it's not as abstract. I find that really interesting, that it's kind of something that you experience rather than something that you think about in terms of okay, this is what's going to happen in the future, or this is what happened in the past.
I mean, I think for me the work isn't speculative because I can see parts of the technological landscape that we're in now existing with these kinds of conversations and with these kinds of things that are happening in MOTONATION. But I think, it's interesting that you brought up essentially speculative economies, and it's interesting to think about that as being like the thing that informs GDP, or like stocks and bonds is all like, that's all speculation. And it's interesting that is also built on the kind of like the access to like high frequency trading networks of the internet. So who's got the most money to put into having really quick internet to get like split second sort of, I don't know, I don't really think I'm explaining this very well, but like just the idea that the whole economical system of the world is almost based on speculation is super weird to me. Like that's incredibly weird. But I don't think your work operates on that speculative thing, because I can see that, the kind of the whole heads up display of the bike scene, and thinking about this bike talking to us. We have all of this. We have this with Alexa. We have these devices that can do things for us just with our voice. So to me, it is more uncanny. It is more in that surreal, as you were saying.
Yeah, and people are developing very intimate relationships with like ChatGPT. At this point, I feel like I also have a inappropriate relationship.
Oh, really?
I mean, it just not like in a sexual way, but in a.
Do you rely
save
on
that
it?
for episode 2?
Yeah.
So do you rely on it for things that you would have usually maybe relied on your own?
Yeah, exactly.
Thought process for?
Exactly.
It's interesting how a lot of us have adopted it. When I was very against it, and a lot of teachers. I mean, Jelena, you're a lecturer, so for you, I would imagine that there's been a whole debate around the use of that kind of thing in universities and stuff. But how we're all kind of just adopting these things that we a month ago said that we hated.
Yeah, exactly, and also how kind of helpless we are. We really don't know we really don't know how to respond to it. There are so many kind of ideas. Okay, this is how we should use it in education, and this is how we shouldn't use it. And then we need to make these statements, and then we need to all agree. And actually, nobody knows how it's going to impact us, how it's already impacting us, and what we should do.
I mean, I remember how the Amazon Echo and the Alexa got away with that, was that they just used to give them out for free. With any purchase at one point, I think. So whether you wanted one or not, you had one. And I think I'm wondering actually, is the grid a bit like that? Like, do you just get given the access to this bike, or is it like a monthly subscription service? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, these are also questions that I think, obviously, I think it's interesting in sci-fi formats to play around with how much of this information you reveal and how much of this information is kind of up for the viewer's imagination. Is this a utility? Is this a subscription-based thing? Is it a state-owned thing? How does it actually work? And to kind of open up these questions.
Before we wrap up, since obviously this work was not made alone, are there any credits which you'd like to give for people who have been involved with or performed in the piece?
Yeah, I would like to mention and also thank and add a big shout out to the people who were kind of lending their character to the work, who are Cedo, who appeared in the work as himself, and completely kind of blended his own character with the role that was written for him. And Maria Iva Gocic, who's an amazing performer who played her sanctuary in the work, and everybody else who performed. And also I would like to mention Tamas Marketan, who made the soundtrack for the piece.
Before we end, also, we'll be sharing some links that Jelena has, which will be an excerpt of the film. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, an excerpt of the film and some other links that Jelena might provide us with to some of the references. Is that right? Do you want to share some of those? I don't know. Yeah.
I can add some. I can add the references to the works that I've mentioned in the conversation.
Yeah.
That's all for now. Thank you so much, Jelena.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Happy
2026.
New Year. May.
Yes.
2025.
2025.
Yeah. May all your desires come true. Great.
And happy nations.
Perfect. I'm going to end it there.